Imagine standing at the threshold of 1,000 years of bloodshed. You're a knight in 1095, and your soul is tormented by the sins of war. The men you've killed, the villages you've raided, the widows you've created. Every night you fear damnation. Every morning you wake wondering if God will ever forgive you. Then one day a pope tells you there is a way. Fight his war, shed more blood, and God will wipe your slate clean. Worse yet, he offers you immortal glory, sacred redemption, and the chance to reclaim the holiest city on earth. What would you do? This is the story of the First Crusade, a moment when Europe erupted in religious fervor, when thousands of ordinary people risked everything on faith, violence, and the promise of salvation. Is the story of how one pope's call to arms changed the course of history and left a bloody mark on the world that echoes even today. We begin not in Europe, but in the shadow of empires collapsing. It is the 11th century, and the Mediterranean world is divided by an invisible wall. On one side stand the Christian powers of Europe and the Byzantine Empire, guardians of ancient Rome's legacy and keepers of the Christian faith. On the other side rises the Islamic world, an empire stretching from Spain to India, with Muslim dynasties controlling trade routes, cities, and sacred lands. These two worlds are not at peace. They are neighbors locked in an uneasy tension, occasionally erupting into war, forever suspicious of each other's intentions. But something is about to change that will transform this regional conflict into something far greater. In the vast deserts of Central Asia, a new power is gathering. The Seljuk Turks, warriors and horsemen from the steppes, have begun their migration southward. They are not a people of cities or philosophy. They are warriors, driven by ambition and faith. Adopting Sunni Islam as their religion, they begin to carve out an empire with their swords and horses. By the middle of the 11th century, they are unstoppable, and one empire stands directly in their path: the Byzantine Empire, the last great Christian power of the East. This is where our story truly begins, because the Byzantines are about to face an enemy that will nearly destroy them, and that desperate plea for help will change everything. Kibrahui. The year is 1071, near a small town called Manzikert, in the eastern frontier of Anatolia. Two armies meet. The Byzantine Emperor, Constantine X Ducas, has gathered his forces to push back the Seljuk threat. What should have been a routine military operation turns into a catastrophe. The Seljuk Sultan, Alp Arslan, outmaneuvers the Byzantine forces. The Christian army is surrounded, confused, torn apart. Soldiers fall by the thousands. It is not just a defeat. It is a humiliation that will reshape the entire region. One Byzantine soldier who survived would later write of the horror, describing how the Turkish arrows fell like rain, how the cavalry charges left no time to think, only to react and die. The psychological impact of Manzikert reverberates through Constantinople for decades. In the aftermath of this shattering loss, the Seljuks do not stop. They pour into Anatolia, the heartland of the Byzantine Empire, conquering city after city. Nicaea, a city so important to early Christian history, falls. Antioch, where the followers of Jesus were first called Christians, falls to Turkish control. The Byzantines are losing not just territory, but their identity, their history, their sacred places. For a Christian empire that has stood for nearly 1,000 years since Rome fell, this is apocalyptic. The empire that defeated Persia, that built great cathedrals and preserved the knowledge of the ancient world, is being dismantled by desert warriors on horseback. Tibru. But then, in 1092, something unexpected happens. The great Sultan Malik Shah, who unified the Seljuk Empire and drove their expansion, dies. What seemed like an unstoppable force begins to fracture. Warlords fight over his inheritance. Local generals, called atabegs, carve out their own kingdoms and turn their swords against each other. The Islamic world, which seems so unified and powerful, is suddenly divided against itself. This presents an opportunity, a desperate one, but an opportunity nonetheless. In Constantinople, the reigning emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, begins to think strategically. Perhaps, he reasons, he can use this moment of chaos. Perhaps he can find allies. Perhaps he can push back. In 1095, Emperor Alexios does something that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. He sends a request westward, across the Mediterranean, across lands he does not fully control, to the Pope in Rome. He is asking for soldiers. He is asking for mercenaries from the Western Christian world. He is asking for help from his fellow Christians, whom he has not trusted, whom his church has been in conflict with for decades. The empire is desperate enough to set aside old grievances. But Alexios has no idea what his request will unleash. He is thinking tactically, strategically, in terms of military forces and territorial recovery. He has no concept of the religious earthquake about to strike Europe. He has no idea that his plea will spark something far more powerful than armies. It will spark a movement that will consume a continent. In the autumn of 1095, Pope Urban II stands before a vast crowd in the French city of Clermont. He is not a simple religious figure. He is a politician, a strategist, a man of ambition. He looks out at the assembled clergy and nobility, and he begins to speak. His words are carefully chosen, for he understands the power of language, the power of appeal to the deepest fears and hopes of human beings. He speaks of the Eastern Christians suffering under Muslim rule. He speaks of the holy places desecrated by infidels. He speaks of Jerusalem, a city that has captured the imagination of Christian Europe for 1,000 years, a city sacred beyond measure, a city that has been in Muslim hands for 400 years. But Urban is clever. He does not merely appeal to piety. He appeals to fear, to ambition, to the deepest anxieties of his audience. He tells them of a promise. He tells them that whoever takes up the cross, whoever leaves home and family and security to march east and fight in the name of Christ, whoever sheds blood in this holy war, will receive something precious beyond measure. They will receive absolution for their sins in an age when men fear damnation, when they lie awake at night thinking about hell, when they believe that their violent lives and sinful deeds doom them to eternal punishment. The Pope offers a path to redemption. More than that, he offers it through violence, through the very thing they have been taught to fear for their souls. He tells them that their sins, the murders they have committed in service to their feudal lords, the peasants they have robbed, the women they have violated in war, all of this can be erased by fighting his war. It is a staggering offer. It is, in many ways, the perfect weapon. Imagine being one of these knights. You have been trained your entire life for war. You have spent your days on horseback, learning to kill with a lance, learning to strike with a sword, learning to command men and take what you want by force. But your faith teaches you that this life is damning you. Your very nature, your training, your role in society, all of it is sending you toward hell. And now the Pope stands before you and says that you can transform this curse into blessing. You can take those very skills, use them in God's name, and instead of damnation, you will receive salvation. The crowd's response is electric. Men cry out, Deus vult, God wills it. The words spread through the assembly like fire through dry grass. This is not a measured decision. This is religious fervor, raw and powerful and immediate. Urban's offer spreads beyond Clermont. Messengers carry word across France into Germany, through Italy, across to England and beyond. Knights begin to take up the cross, literally wearing a cross on their garments to mark their commitment. These men call themselves Crusaders, but something unexpected happens. Urban had hoped to lead a military campaign, an organized force of nobility and experienced soldiers. What he gets instead is far vaster and far less controllable. The call spreads to the common people, peasants, townspeople, people with no military training whatsoever, begin to believe that God is calling them to this war. A French priest named Peter the Hermit becomes an unexpected leader of this popular movement. He travels across Europe, preaching the crusade, and people follow him in ever-growing numbers. By the spring of 1096, tens of thousands of ordinary people have decided to leave their homes and march to the Holy Land. But there is a darkness lurking in this religious enthusiasm, a shadow that would only grow longer as the crusade progressed. As these crusaders gathered in the Rhineland, they began to see enemies closer to home. They saw the Jewish communities of Germany, people who lived among them, and they began to ask themselves, why should they march thousands of miles to fight infidels when there were non-believers right here, living in Christian lands, practicing an alien faith? Local prejudices, long simmering beneath the surface, erupted into violence. Crusaders attacked Jewish communities with shocking brutality. They massacred men, women, and children. Contemporary chronicles report that around 5,000 Jews were killed in these attacks. The perpetrators saw themselves as holy warriors, purifying Christian lands before embarking on their sacred mission. The church officially condemned these massacres, but the condemnations rang hollow and had little effect. The violence had tapped into something darker than religious zeal. It had tapped into fear, prejudice, and the justification that faith can provide for hatred. In the summer of 1096, the People's Crusade set out eastward. Peter the Hermit led a force of between 20 and 40,000 men, women, and children, mostly peasants and common folk, with a smattering of lower nobility. These people had never fought as an organized army. They had no supply lines, no clear strategy, no experienced commanders. What they had was faith, desperation, and the belief that God would provide. They headed down the Danube River toward Constantinople, moving through Christian lands, through territories that belonged to the Byzantine Empire's allies. And here, in their desperate march, they revealed a terrible truth about the crusade. These were not trained soldiers on a disciplined military campaign. They were a migration of hungry, desperate people who took what they needed to survive. When they reached Hungary and food ran out, they did not ask permission. They attacked Christian settlements. They looted towns. They stole from their supposed allies in the name of their sacred mission. By the time they reached Constantinople, the local population had grown to fear them as much as any enemy army. Emperor Alexios watched these masses arrive at his gates with a mixture of shock and alarm. This was not the small force of professional soldiers he had requested. This was a horde that threatened to destabilize his capital. He quickly made a decision. He would resupply them, provide them with guides, and send them across the Bosporus Strait into Anatolia as rapidly as possible. He needed them gone. The People's Crusade crossed into enemy territory, ill-equipped, poorly organized, and completely unprepared for what awaited them. The Seljuk Turks were waiting. In the autumn of 1096, the Turkish forces attacked. They moved in swift cavalry strikes against the Crusader encampments. The Christians, disorganized and panicked, were unable to mount an effective defense. The massacre was decisive and brutal. Most of the People's Crusade was destroyed. Thousands were killed. The few survivors fled back to Constantinople or were captured into slavery. Peter the Hermit managed to escape and would later encounter the more organized Crusader armies that followed. But while this tragic disaster was unfolding in Anatolia, something very different was happening in Europe. The great feudal lords of Western Christendom, the powerful princes and counts who controlled vast territories, had also taken up the cross. These were not peasants or townspeople. These were the military elite of Europe, the men who had trained for warfare their entire lives, who could command hundreds or thousands of professional soldiers. These were the warrior class that Europe had developed through feudalism. Men whose entire identity was bound up in warfare and conquest. From France came Godfrey of Bouillon, a nobleman from Lorraine whose piety would later make him a legendary figure in Crusader mythology. With him came his brothers, Eustace and Baldwin of Boulogne, capable commanders in their own right. From France also came Hugh of Vermandois, brother to the French king himself, carrying royal prestige and expectations. Count Robert of Flanders brought his forces, as did Robert Duke of Normandy, son of the great William the Conqueror, a man with hereditary claims to power and legitimacy. From the south came Count Raymond of Toulouse and the wealthy noble Stephen of Blois, bringing soldiers and resources. And from southern Italy came a man whose very name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies and rivals alike, Bohemond of Taranto. Bohemond was a Norman adventurer, a man who had spent his life fighting in Italy, fighting against the Byzantines, fighting for land and plunder. He had a reputation for ruthlessness, for cunning, for an absolute willingness to pursue his own interests regardless of broader loyalties. To Emperor Alexios, Bohemond represented both a valuable asset and a dangerous threat. These various commanders did not travel together initially. They gathered at different times, each bringing their own forces, each representing their own interests and ambitions. But slowly, throughout late 1096 and into early 1097, they converged on Constantinople. By the time all the major forces had arrived, they had formed the largest army Europe had assembled since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Contemporary accounts suggest their combined force numbered around 60,000 warriors, possibly even more. Among these were perhaps 10,000 armored knights, the heavy cavalry that made European armies so formidable, warriors on horseback wearing armor and wielding lances that could pierce through ordinary foot soldiers like a hot knife through butter. Emperor Alexios had expected to receive a manageable force of mercenaries, whom he could direct according to his strategic needs. What he received instead was a vast, independent army that had sworn oaths to the Pope, not to him. He watched them arrive with growing anxiety. Bohemond's presence in particular troubled him. Here was a man who had made his career raiding Byzantine territories, and now he was arriving with a massive army at the gates of Constantinople. Alexios was shrewd enough to understand the danger. He needed to control these crusaders, at least enough to ensure they did not become a greater threat to his empire than the Seljuk Turks they were supposedly here to fight. He began a careful diplomatic dance. He provided money, supplies, and provisions. He offered his military expertise and guidance. But he did not do so freely. He extracted oaths of loyalty from each of the great commanders. He made them swear that any Byzantine lands they reconquered would be returned to the empire, not kept as their own conquests. Only after these oaths were secured did he allow them to cross the Bosporus and march into Anatolia. As spring turned to summer in 1097, the Crusader army marched south and east into Anatolia, the great peninsula that had been the heartland of the Byzantine Empire, and was now controlled by various Seljuk Turkish powers. The Crusaders were about to face an enemy entirely different from anything they had encountered in Europe. The Turkish cavalry were lighter, faster, more mobile than the heavily armored knights. They fought using composite bows, deadly weapons made from wood, bone, and sinew that could send arrows with incredible accuracy and power from horseback. The Turkish tactics relied on speed, deception, and the devastating effectiveness of archery. Against a knight in armor, moving slowly on a horse, arrows that could penetrate not just skin but sometimes even armor could be devastating. The heat of Anatolia was also a shock to these European warriors. Many had never experienced such conditions. Men fell ill, horses died from exhaustion and heat, supplies ran short. The Crusaders would have to adapt or be destroyed, but fortune smiled on them in one crucial way. The Islamic world, far from being unified against them, was deeply divided. The Seljuk Empire, which had seemed so powerful and unified under Sultan Malik Shah, had fragmented after his death. Turkish Atabegs fought each other for supremacy. Local Muslim rulers pursued their own interests. The Fatimid dynasty of Egypt, which controlled much of the southern Mediterranean coast and had recently conquered Jerusalem, did not see the Seljuk Turks as allies, but as rivals and threats. In some cases, local Muslim rulers would actually send supplies to the Crusaders or maintain neutrality, hoping to use them against their Seljuk enemies. This division in the Islamic world would prove crucial to the Crusaders' eventual success. The Crusaders' first major test came at the city of Nicaea in June of 1097. This was not some minor fortress, but a significant city with strong walls and a large garrison of Turkish defenders. The Crusaders surrounded it and began a siege. The city's defenders were skilled and well supplied. The Crusaders, despite their numbers and military capability, struggled to penetrate the defenses. Days turned into weeks. The siege stretched into June, then July. The Crusaders lost men to disease, combat, and accidents, but they also learned that patience and persistence could accomplish what frontal assault could not. Finally, after 6 weeks of siege, the city surrendered. But here, a crisis moment emerged between the Crusaders and their Byzantine allies. The Crusaders expected to sack the city, to take plunder and loot, as was the custom of medieval warfare. But Emperor Alexios, carefully maintaining his authority, had arranged the surrender so that the city would come under Byzantine control, not Crusader control. The angry Crusaders were denied their expected spoils, a slight that further poisoned the relationship between the Crusaders and the Byzantines. The resentment and distrust that would grow from moments like this would eventually tear apart the fragile coalition. But the Crusaders had no time to dwell on these conflicts. They needed to press forward. They had supplies, they had momentum, and above all, they had an objective that burned in their minds: Jerusalem, the Holy Land, the goal that drove them onward despite hardship, despite suffering, despite the nagging doubts that sometimes crept into even the most faithful hearts. From Nicaea, the Crusader army headed inland, moving through the interior of Anatolia. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving. In June and July, the sun beat down relentlessly on the armored knights, turning their armor into furnaces. Soldiers collapsed from heat exhaustion. Water sources were scarce. The Crusaders had to split into 2 separate groups to better feed themselves and find resources. The vanguard, led by the ruthless and ambitious Bohemond of Taranto, marched ahead. Behind them came the main force, led by Godfrey of Bouillon and the other commanders. This separation would have fateful consequences. Near the town of Dorylaeum, in July of 1097, the Turkish forces struck. The main Turkish army, under the command of Kilij Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan, had been gathering forces for a counterattack. They had watched the Crusaders advance, had studied their methods, had understood that these European warriors were formidable but also vulnerable. Kilij Arslan chose to concentrate his forces against Bohemond's vanguard, hoping to destroy them before the main Crusader force could arrive. The attack came at dawn. Turkish riders appeared from the hills and valleys surrounding Bohemond's camp. They moved with terrifying speed and efficiency. The Crusaders, caught partially unprepared but not completely surprised, scrambled to organize a defense. Bohemond, a veteran of many battles and possessed of genuine military skill, quickly assessed the situation. He ordered his knights to form a defensive position around the Crusader camp. Infantry soldiers were arranged behind the knights, forming a human barrier. The camp followers, the merchants, the servants, the women, the children who traveled with the army for supplies and support, were moved to the rear. The Turkish cavalry launched repeated attacks. They came in waves, their bows sending clouds of arrows that whistled through the air. The Crusaders, most of them never having faced such tactics before, had to learn quickly or die. They learned to crouch behind their shields, learned that the best defense against a mounted archer was to hold position and absorb the losses until the enemy came close enough that the Crusader knights could use their lances and swords. Men fell on both sides. The heat and fear and noise of battle are things that can never be fully understood by those who have not experienced them. Soldiers describe the sound as overwhelming, a chaos of screams and impacts and the neighing of wounded horses. The The Crusaders held. For hours they held. Bohemond, seeing that his position was being tested but not broken, sent urgent messengers racing back to the main Crusader force, begging for reinforcements. Godfrey of Bouillon received the message and understood the danger immediately. He gathered his forces and began a rapid march toward Bohemond's position. The knights rode hard, covering ground as quickly as horses could carry them. The main Turkish army, focused on their assault against Bohemond's vanguard, did not see the reinforcements arriving until they had nearly arrived. As the Crusader reinforcements crested a ridge overlooking the battle, the Turkish forces suddenly realized they faced a much larger and more complete Crusader force than they had anticipated. But this alone might not have been enough to break the Turkish attack. What changed the course of the battle was tactical positioning. The Crusader reinforcements did not attack frontally. Instead, they began to move around the Turkish positions, threatening to encircle and cut off the Turkish forces. They had defeated a much larger force through a combination of superior discipline, tactical excellence, religious fervor, and the belief that God was on their side. News of this victory spread rapidly through the Crusader army and back to Europe. Stories of miracles and divine intervention were embellished and retold. The Crusaders began to believe more deeply than ever that their mission was blessed by God Himself. Over the following months, the Crusader forces slowly gathered themselves for the final push southward toward Jerusalem. Not all of them went. Bohemond remained in Antioch, which he had claimed as his own. But the bulk of the Crusader army, under the general leadership of Raymond of Toulouse and Godfrey of Bouillon, began the final leg of their journey. As they marched south through the lands of the Levant, they encountered a landscape very different from the harsh interior of Anatolia. This was a land of cities and farms, a land that had been fought over for centuries. Many of the local Muslim rulers, recognizing the strength and ruthlessness of the Crusaders, chose not to resist. Some offered supplies and money to encourage the Crusaders to move through their lands quickly and then move on. Other settlements were abandoned as the Crusaders approached. The Crusaders moved with relative speed through the coastal region, sometimes meeting resistance, sometimes negotiating safe passage. But as they approached Jerusalem, the evidence of the approaching conflict became more and more obvious. Wells were poisoned. Trees were cut down so that Crusaders could not use them for wood or shade. Animals were driven away from the roads. Everything that could possibly help the Crusaders had been destroyed or removed by the defenders, who knew that an army this size, moving through hostile territory, would be desperate for resources. The Crusaders understood that they were moving into a land that had been deliberately stripped to deny them sustenance. Yet they pressed forward, driven by a goal that had consumed their thoughts for years. And then, on June 7, 1099, after nearly 4 years of travel and warfare, they saw it. Jerusalem, the holy city. The Crusaders saw the walls of the city rising in the distance, and something broke inside many of them. Men wept openly. Soldiers fell to their knees in the dust and prayed. Knights who had faced death and killing without flinching found themselves overwhelmed with emotion. This was the reason they had left their homes. This was the reason they had endured hunger, disease, the loss of friends and brothers, the horrors of medieval warfare. This was why they had taken up the cross. After years of suffering, after thousands of miles traveled, after countless hardships that had tested their faith and their resolve, they had finally arrived at the goal that had sustained them. For a moment, all the political disputes, all the conflicts between the leaders, all the divisions that had plagued the crusade seemed insignificant. They were here. They had reached Jerusalem. But the reality of their situation quickly reasserted itself. The city that they gazed upon was a fortress. Its walls were strong and well maintained. The city sat on hills that gave its defenders tremendous advantages. And most critically, the Crusaders had been depleted. Their numbers had shrunk dramatically. What had begun as perhaps 60,000 soldiers had been reduced by disease, combat, and desertion to perhaps 12,000 fighting men. The Muslim defenders inside Jerusalem were outnumbered by Crusaders. But the Crusaders did not have the overwhelming numerical advantage that would typically be needed to assault a fortified city. Jerusalem was not going to fall to a frontal assault. It would require siege warfare, and siege warfare requires resources, particularly wood for building siege engines. The landscape around Jerusalem was essentially desert. There were few trees. The local population, understanding the approaching threat, had done everything they could to deny the Crusaders resources. The Crusaders needed to build siege towers, massive wooden structures that would allow them to approach the city walls and fight the defenders at close quarters. But where would they get the wood? For days, the Crusaders searched. They scavenged what they could find, but it was not enough. Then an opportunity appeared. A Crusader fleet from Genoa, the Italian Maritime Republic, that had significant naval power in the Mediterranean, arrived at the coastal city of Jaffa. The Genoese sailors understood the Crusader need. They took apart their ships, dismantling the wooden vessels that had carried them across the sea, and transported the timber overland to the Crusader camps outside Jerusalem. It was an extraordinary sacrifice and an extraordinary logistical feat. Wooden ships, converted into siege weapons, would become the instruments that would help breach the walls of the Holy City. The Crusaders gathered additional wood from the surrounding region, scavenging every piece of timber they could find. Slowly, under the direction of engineers, and with the labor of thousands of soldiers and support staff, siege towers began to take shape. These structures were designed to be moved on wheels up to the city walls. They had multiple levels, allowing Crusaders to climb into them and be carried upward until they reached the height of the walls themselves. Ramps or bridges could then be extended from the siege towers to allow Crusaders to fight their way onto the walls and into the city. 2 major siege towers were constructed, one positioned near the southwest corner of the city under the command of Count Raymond of Toulouse, and another in the north, where Godfrey of Bouillon and his forces would mount their assault. As the Crusaders prepared their siege engines, they engaged in prayer and ritual. On July 8, 1099, the entire Crusader army performed a religious procession around the city. This was not merely military preparation, but spiritual preparation. The Crusaders, believing that they were engaged in a holy war blessed by God, understood that spiritual strength was as important as military strength. They processed around the walls, carrying relics and holy objects, singing hymns and prayers. The Muslim defenders watched from the walls, understanding that they faced not merely soldiers, but religious zealots who believed that God was on their side. That night, the Crusaders performed vigils and prayers on the Mount of Olives, the hill where Jesus had prayed before his crucifixion, according to Christian tradition. The assault was planned for July 14th, but in the night before the attack, Godfrey made a crucial tactical decision. He ordered the siege tower positioned in the north to be moved to a different location, a section of the wall that appeared to be less heavily defended. The defenders had concentrated their forces in certain areas, expecting the assault to come there. By moving his siege tower, Godfrey was attempting to catch the defenders off guard, to strike where they were weakest. It was a risk, but Godfrey understood that timing and surprise could be as important as overwhelming force. On the morning of July 15, 1099, the final assault on Jerusalem began. The Crusaders advanced on multiple fronts. The siege towers were moved forward on their wheels, advancing slowly but inexorably toward the city walls. The Muslim defenders responded with everything they had. They fired arrows from the walls, they threw stones and burning logs down on the advancing Crusaders. They attempted to move their own defensive structures to counter the Crusader siege towers. The battle was chaos and noise and terror, the concentrated fury of medieval siege warfare. Men screamed, arrows whistled through the air, the sound of impacts, of metal striking metal, of wood creaking and groaning under stress, filled the air. In the north, Godfrey's gamble paid off. The siege tower, positioned against a section of the wall where the defenders were fewer in number, began to have effect. Crusaders climbed into the tower, ascending its levels. As the tower was pushed against the wall, Crusaders found themselves at the height of the defenders on the wall. Fighting began at close quarters. The Crusaders, disciplined and heavily armed, began to gain the advantage. A bridge or ramp was extended from the siege tower to the wall, creating a pathway for Crusaders to cross from the tower directly onto the wall. Godfrey himself, or his commanders, led the charge across this dangerous bridge. Crusaders began to pour across, fighting the defenders hand to hand. The defenders, sensing that the wall was being breached, began to fall back. The breakthrough in the north triggered a cascade of collapses in the Muslim defense. Crusaders who had entered the city from the north began to fight their way deeper into the city streets. Other Crusaders, seeing that the wall had been breached, fought with renewed fury to expand the breakthrough. The defenders, what followed was not a military operation, but a massacre. The Crusaders, having finally breached the defenses after weeks of siege, faced another claims that the horses could barely move through the streets because of the bodies piled up on the ground. These accounts are likely exaggerated by the chroniclers, but they capture something true about the scope of the violence. The Jewish quarter of Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders. Jewish residents who had lived in the city for centuries were given a choice: convert to Christianity or die. Those who refused were slaughtered. Entire families were killed in the synagogues where they had taken refuge. The Crusaders showed no mercy, driven by religious fervor and the belief that they were purifying the holy city by eliminating non-believers. The massacre continued throughout the afternoon and into the evening. By nightfall, it is estimated that somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 people had been killed, though the exact numbers remain uncertain and likely unknowable. The streets of Jerusalem ran with blood. The smell of death permeated the city. When the killing finally subsided, when the Crusaders finally exhausted themselves or ran out of targets, they made their way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site where Christians believed the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus had taken place. They entered the church, still carrying weapons, still covered in blood, and they wept. They prayed. They believed that they had accomplished a miracle, that they had reclaimed the holiest site in Christendom from the hands of infidels. For them, the massacre they had just committed was not a crime but an act of religious purification, a necessary violence in service of God. The Crusaders, who had set out nearly 4 years earlier believing that they were engaged in a holy war, that violence committed in God's name would bring them salvation, now believed that they had been vindicated. The aftermath of Jerusalem's fall was complex and troubling. The Crusaders established a government, and after some dispute, Godfrey of Bouillon was chosen as the leader, receiving the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre rather than king, as Godfrey believed that no human should claim to be king of a city belonging to Christ. But the political divisions that had plagued the crusade from its inception now became even more apparent. Different Crusader leaders claimed different territories. Raymond of Toulouse wanted to establish his own domain. Bohemond, already ruling Antioch, had his own interests. Baldwin, established in Edessa, had his own kingdom. The Crusaders had conquered the Holy Land, but they were divided among themselves about how to govern it and how to divide the spoils of conquest. One significant challenge emerged almost immediately. The Crusaders had killed so many people that they had eliminated much of the local population that would normally provide labor, agriculture, and services that a functioning society requires. The Crusaders had inherited a land that was economically devastated by the siege and the massacre. They faced the task of rebuilding a functioning society while simultaneously defending it against enemies. That defense would be tested almost immediately. Within weeks of the Crusaders' arrival in Jerusalem, a Fatimid relief army arrived at the coastal city of Ascalon, south of Jerusalem, with the intention of retaking the holy city. The Crusaders, despite their exhaustion, despite the chaos of governing a newly conquered city, mobilized to meet this threat. On August 12, 1099, less than a month after the capture of Jerusalem, the Crusaders faced the Fatimid army at the Battle of Ascalon. The Crusaders were outnumbered, but they were also filled with religious confidence and battle experience. The Fatimid forces, composed primarily of infantry rather than the cavalry that the Crusaders had learned to counter, were vulnerable to Crusader cavalry charges. The battle was decisive. The Fatimid army was broken. The Crusaders charged, and the Fatimid soldiers, unprepared for the ferocity and discipline of the Crusader assault, broke and fled. The Crusaders pursued them, slaughtering thousands. After the battle, the Crusaders moved to reinforce their control of the coastal regions, preventing the Fatimids from easily launching another invasion. But victory came at a cost to the Crusaders themselves. Most of the men who had begun the crusade almost 4 years earlier now considered their vows fulfilled. They had survived the journey. They had reached Jerusalem. They had fought in the Holy War. Many were exhausted. Many were ill. Many missed their homes and families. The crusade had consumed years of their lives and had fundamentally changed them. They had seen things that no amount of training in medieval warfare could have prepared them for. They had lost brothers and friends. Some of the original Crusaders who had embarked from Europe were never going to see home again, killed by disease, combat, or accident along the way. A mass exodus began. Crusaders who had taken temporary vows or who believed their obligations had been met began the long journey home. Some traveled by sea if they could afford passage. Others began the long walk back westward, retracing the route they had traveled, passing through the same territories that had been devastated by their arrival. It was a journey as dangerous and difficult as the outbound journey had been. Many would not make it home, but those who did would carry with them stories and memories that would shape European attitudes toward the Islamic world for centuries to come. Among those who stayed behind was Godfrey of Bouillon and a small force of approximately 300 knights. Godfrey took on the responsibility of defending the newly established Christian kingdom in Jerusalem against the threats that surrounded it. He ruled for less than a year, dying in 1100. But in that short time, he established the framework for what would become the Kingdom of Jerusalem. His successors, most notably his brother Baldwin, who left Edessa to take over his role, would develop the Crusader states into functioning, if precarious, political entities that would survive for nearly 2 centuries before eventually being overwhelmed by Islamic forces. The Crusader states that emerged from the First Crusade were fragile and constantly under pressure. The Kingdom of Jerusalem controlled the southern coast and the Holy City itself. The county of Edessa, ruled by Baldwin, controlled the northern frontier. The Principality of Antioch, ruled by Bohemond and his successors, controlled the wealthy northern coast. The county of Tripoli, established later by Raymond of Toulouse's heirs, controlled the central coast. These 4 Crusader states existed in the midst of a sea of Islamic powers, surrounded on all sides by Muslim-ruled territories. They were constantly at war, constantly struggling to maintain their territorial integrity, constantly threatened by reconquest. Back in Europe, news of the Crusades' success spread rapidly. Pope Urban II, the man who had called the crusade, received word that Jerusalem had fallen to Christian forces. For a brief moment, he experienced the triumph of his vision. But Urban II died just 2 weeks after receiving news of Jerusalem's capture, denied the pleasure of seeing his achievement fully developed. His successors, however, would build on his accomplishment. More crusades would be called. More armies would be sent eastward to reinforce and defend the Crusader states. For nearly 2 centuries, Crusaders would flow from Europe to the Levant, some motivated by genuine religious faith, others motivated by the possibility of land and wealth, still others motivated by the simple fact that crusading had become a central part of European identity and tradition. But the Islamic world would not remain divided indefinitely. The success of the First Crusade had shocked and horrified the Muslim powers of the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East. They began to recognize that the Crusaders were not a temporary phenomenon that would be easily defeated or absorbed. They began to unify. Great commanders like Saladin would eventually emerge, leaders who would unite the fractious Islamic states and launch a coordinated counteroffensive against the Crusader kingdoms. Saladin's victory at the Horns of Hattin in 1187 would shatter Crusader military power in the region. The reconquest of Jerusalem in that same year would reverse the great achievement of the First Crusade. But in 1099, the Crusaders did not know this future. They did not know that their great achievement would be temporary, that their grand strategy of permanent conquest would ultimately fail. In 1099, they believed that they had changed history. They believed that they had demonstrated the power of faith united with military force. They believed that God had blessed their endeavor. And in many ways, they were correct. The First Crusade did change history. It changed the political map of the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. It changed the relationship between Christianity and Islam, introducing a level of religious hostility and violent confrontation that would persist until the modern era. It demonstrated the power of religious fervor as a motivating force for large-scale military action. It showed that a pope, using religious language and spiritual incentives, could mobilize thousands of people to take up arms and traverse half the world. The legacy of the First Crusade is complex and contested. For Crusaders and medieval Christians, it represented a great victory for faith, a moment when Christian warriors successfully challenged Islamic dominance and reclaimed sacred Christian lands. For Muslims of the era, and for modern Islamic scholars and historians, the Crusade represented an invasion, an attack by Western Christians on Islamic lands, the beginning of centuries of religious violence and cultural conflict. For modern historians, the Crusade represents both. It was a moment of genuine religious fervor and profound violence, a moment when people of different faiths clashed with terrible consequences, a moment that demonstrated both the heights of human idealism and the depths of human brutality. The Crusaders who survived and returned to Europe brought with them stories of the East, accounts of cities and people, and wonders they had never imagined. These stories transformed European knowledge of the wider world. They stimulated trade and cultural exchange. They sparked a hunger for more knowledge about distant lands. In some ways, the Crusades were a precursor to the age of exploration that would come centuries later, when European nations would begin to expand their influence across the globe. But the immediate impact of the First Crusade was more localized and more violent. It established the Crusader states in the Levant. It demonstrated the military capability of united European forces, and it set in motion a cycle of religious violence that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean for generations. The men who had set out from Europe in 1096, driven by promises of spiritual salvation, by the appeal of a great religious mission, by the desire to atone for their sins through holy war, had accomplished something extraordinary. They had traveled thousands of miles through hostile territory. They had fought enemies superior in knowledge of terrain and cavalry tactics. They had survived disease and starvation. They had conquered fortified cities, and they had captured Jerusalem. But the cost had been immense. Tens of thousands of Crusaders had died. Local populations had been decimated. Relationships between Christians and Muslims, which had been competitive and hostile before, now became actively violent in a new and more intense way. The world would never be quite the same. The weapons and tactics that had proven so effective for the Crusaders would continue to define medieval warfare for centuries to come. The armored knight on horseback remained the dominant military force in Europe and the Mediterranean. The Crusaders' discovery that organized Christian armies could defeat the Turkish cavalry, that discipline and organization could overcome superior mobility and archery, influenced military thinking and strategy throughout the region. The siege tactics that the Crusaders developed, the use of siege towers and coordinated assaults, became standard practices in medieval warfare. Future crusades would employ similar tactics with varying degrees of success. But the First Crusade also revealed the limitations of Crusader warfare when operating in distant lands without reliable supply lines or local support. The Crusaders' subsequent attempts to hold and expand their territorial gains in the Levant would be far more difficult than the initial conquest. They would have to defend against constant attack from surrounding Islamic powers. They would have to manage complex political relationships with both local populations and with each other. They would have to adapt to a climate and environment fundamentally different from Europe. Some Crusader kingdoms would prove to be more resilient and successful than others, but none would achieve the stability or security that they hoped for. The papacy, having successfully mobilized a massive Crusader army through religious fervor, would attempt to repeat the feat multiple times. The Second Crusade, called in 1147, would be less successful than the first, ending in failure and disappointment. The Third Crusade, called in response to Saladin's reconquest of Jerusalem, would be an enormous undertaking involving the kings of England, France, and other major European powers, but it too would ultimately fail to retake Jerusalem. Subsequent crusades would be called, some focused on recapturing the Holy City, others with different objectives, but none would match the dramatic success of the First Crusade. That first great expedition would remain in many ways the defining crusade, the moment when religious enthusiasm, military capability, and luck combined to achieve an extraordinary goal. The Islamic world, watching the success of the First Crusade and the establishment of Crusader states in the Eastern Mediterranean, began a process of regeneration and counterattack. Local military leaders began to understand that the Crusaders were not going to disappear, that they had established permanent settlements, that they posed a long-term military and political threat. Over the course of decades, Islamic powers that had been divided and fractious began to unify against the Crusader threat. Great commanders like Zengi, Nur ad-Din, and eventually Saladin would emerge, leaders who recognized that only through unity could the Islamic world hope to resist and ultimately reverse the Crusader conquest. These leaders would inspire their followers with a sense of religious mission comparable to the religious fervor that had driven the Crusaders. They would preach jihad, Islamic holy war, with the same passion that the Pope had preached crusade. The result was a centuries-long conflict between Crusaders and Islamic forces. A conflict that would transform the cultural, political, and religious landscape of the Mediterranean and Middle East. Trade patterns would shift, cities would be conquered and reconquered, populations would be displaced, cultural and religious identities would become increasingly polarized. The relatively peaceful coexistence that had characterized Christian-Muslim relations in the Mediterranean before the Crusades, though certainly not without conflict, would be replaced by active, organized religious warfare. The Crusades created a narrative of religious conflict that would persist for centuries and, in some ways, continues to influence attitudes and relationships between the Christian West and the Islamic world, even today. For the individuals who survived the First Crusade, for the men who fought at Jerusalem and returned home to tell the tale, the crusade represented the defining experience of their lives. They had participated in something they believed to be historically significant, something they believed to be divinely ordained. They had accomplished a goal that had seemed impossible when they began. They had demonstrated that faith united with military force could achieve extraordinary things. Whether they were motivated primarily by genuine religious conviction or by the promise of land and plunder, whether they found the experience spiritually fulfilling or morally troubling, the First Crusade had marked them forever. The Crusader kingdoms established in the aftermath of the First Crusade would eventually fall. Jerusalem would be lost to Saladin and Islamic forces. Acre, the last Crusader stronghold, would fall in 1291. The dream of permanent Christian conquest in the Holy Land would be shattered, but the impact of the First Crusade would endure. It would shape European attitudes toward the Islamic world. It would influence the development of military technology and tactics. It would inspire literature, art, and music for centuries. It would be remembered as a great achievement and a great tragedy, depending on one's perspective and religious identity. And it would demonstrate, in perhaps the most vivid way possible, the power of religious faith to mobilize people across distances and borders to accomplish extraordinary things, both heroic and terrible. The First Crusade was over. The long aftermath of violence, conflict, and cultural change had just begun. What had started as a request from a desperate Byzantine emperor for military assistance had become something far larger and far more consequential. A pope's vision of religious warfare had mobilized an entire continent. Thousands of ordinary people had been transformed into soldiers and warriors. Cities had fallen, populations had been devastated, and a new era in the history of the Mediterranean and Middle East had begun. An era characterized by religious conflict, military struggle, and the clash of two civilizations that would struggle for dominance for centuries to come. The legacy of the First Crusade would be written not just in history books, but in the lives of millions of people affected by the centuries of conflict and change that it initiated. Following weeks and months, the various Crusader leaders remained in and around Antioch, consolidating their hold on the city and dealing with the complex questions of governance and resource management. But tensions that had been simmering for months now came to the surface. Bohemond of Taranto, who had taken the leading role in the final capture of Antioch, claimed that the city should become his to rule. He argued that since he had orchestrated the entry into the city, he deserved to rule it as his own principality. This directly violated the oath he had sworn to Emperor Alexios to return Byzantine lands to the empire. Other crusaders objected to Bohemond's claims, but he was powerful enough to enforce them. The fractious nature of Crusader unity became more apparent with each passing day. There was another loss that further damaged the Crusaders' cohesion. Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, who had served as the papal legate and the spiritual leader of the crusade, died of illness in the city. Adhemar had been a unifying presence, a moral authority who could mediate disputes and maintain some sense of higher purpose and unity. His death removed an important center of cohesion, just when the Crusader leadership was becoming increasingly fractious and self-interested. In the absence of Adhemar's moderating influence, the Crusaders were left to their own devices, driven by personal ambitions, regional loyalties, and the desire for wealth and territory. The common soldiers, however, cared little for the political disputes of their leaders. Most of them had taken the Crusade oath not for plunder or territory, but for spiritual salvation. They wanted to continue the journey to Jerusalem. They wanted to reach the Holy City.